30 days in the jungle. No food drops. No water resupply. No radio contact. 5 men against an entire enemy battalion. And when the helicopters finally pulled them out, 45 confirmed kills. 0 Australian casualties. The Pentagon called it statistically impossible. The Australian Defence Force buried it in classified archives for 50 years. And the American Green Berets who witnessed these men in action, they refused to talk about what they saw. Why? Because what those 5 Australians did in the jungles of Phuoc Tuy Province in 1968 broke every rule of modern warfare. Because their methods were so effective and so disturbing that Allied commanders couldn't officially acknowledge them. Because somewhere in the Vietnamese jungle, ordinary sheep farmers and factory workers transformed into something that enemy soldiers could only describe as ghosts. The Vietcong called them Ma Rung, the phantoms of the forest. And for 30 days, those phantoms hunted with techniques that no military academy had ever taught. Techniques passed down through 40,000 years of Aboriginal tracking tradition. Techniques that made American Special Forces question everything they thought they knew about elite warfare. You've heard of the Navy SEALs. You've heard of the Green Berets. But I guarantee you've never heard this story. Because this story was supposed to stay buried forever. Today, we're digging it up. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to learn will change how you think about special operations history. And trust me, the most shocking details, they're coming in the final minutes. Let's begin. The jungle floor was covered with blood that nobody would ever officially acknowledge. Somewhere in the suffocating green hell of Phuoc Tuy Province, 5 Australian SAS operators had just completed their 29th day without resupply, without extraction, without a single radio transmission to confirm they were still breathing. Pentagon analysts would later call this mission statistically impossible. The men who survived it would never speak of it publicly again. This is the story that the Australian Defence Force buried in classified archives for over 5 decades. This is the operation that made American Green Berets question everything they thought they knew about jungle warfare. This is the patrol that Vietnamese villagers still whisper about. The night when ghosts walked through their hamlet and left behind only silence and terror. But this is only the first layer of a secret that goes much deeper. The year was 1968. While American forces were reeling from the psychological devastation of the Tet Offensive, while Walter Cronkite was telling American families that the war was unwinnable, while body bags were arriving at Dover Air Force Base at the rate of 300 per week, a small contingent of Australian special operators was achieving kill ratios that would remain classified for reasons that had nothing to do with national security and everything to do with professional embarrassment. The numbers were simply too humiliating to acknowledge. Australian SAS squadron operating in Phuoc Tuy Province was averaging a kill ratio of over 500 to 1. For every Australian Special Forces soldier lost in combat, over 500 enemy combatants were confirmed eliminated. Compare this to the American average of approximately 12 to 1. Compare this to the celebrated Navy SEALs, who despite their Hollywood reputation, rarely achieved ratios above 25 to 1 in sustained operations. And what the Pentagon discovered next would trigger a classified investigation that remains sealed to this day. The Americans had helicopters, napalm, B-52 strategic bombers, and an unlimited supply chain that could deliver hot meals to firebase personnel while men were dying 50 kilometers away. The Australians had something the Pentagon could never replicate. They had been hunting in hostile wilderness since birth, and they had teachers that no military academy could provide. But this story begins not in a briefing room or a training facility. It begins in the pre-dawn darkness of March 17, 1968, when Patrol Juliet 7 was inserted by helicopter into a landing zone that intelligence had marked as cold, meaning no enemy activity detected within a 5-kilometer radius. The intelligence was catastrophically wrong, and that mistake would set in motion 30 days of horror. Within 4 hours of insertion, the 5-man patrol had counted over 200 Vietcong fighters, moving along a trail system that wasn't supposed to exist. They were trapped in a pocket of jungle approximately 800 meters from what appeared to be a major enemy staging area. Standard operating procedure demanded immediate extraction. Radio contact with Nui Dat base would bring helicopters within 40 minutes. Patrol Commander Sergeant Colin _2_McKenzie made a decision that would have ended his career in any American unit. He ordered complete radio silence. No extraction request, no situation report, nothing. What he planned instead would rewrite the rules of special operations warfare. For the next 30 days, Patrol Juliet 7 would become something that defied military science. To understand what happened next, you must first understand who these men were and how they became the most lethal small unit in the Vietnam War. You must understand the training that turned ordinary Australians into what the Vietcong called, quote, 3, the phantoms of the forest. And you must understand the dark secret that the American military establishment worked so hard to ensure never reached the public. Colin McKenzie grew up on a sheep station in the Western Australian outback, approximately 400 kilometers from the nearest town, with a population over 1,000. By the age of 12, he had spent more nights sleeping under stars than under a roof. By 15, he could track a wounded kangaroo across rocky terrain that left no visible prints to the untrained eye. By 18, he had been recruited into the Australian Army, with a specific notation in his file that read simply, quote, 4. But Mackenzie's true education hadn't even begun yet. His training in the art of human hunting didn't start until he met a man whose name remains classified to this day, an Aboriginal tracker attached to the SAS training cadre, who had learned his craft from an unbroken lineage stretching back over 40,000 years. The Americans had technology. The Australians had something far more dangerous: inherited knowledge that predated civilization itself. In the swamps of North Queensland, in terrain that closely resembled the Vietnamese jungle, Mackenzie spent 6 months learning techniques that no military manual had ever documented. He learned to read the jungle floor like a newspaper, identifying passage times from bent grass blades, determining enemy numbers from the depth of footprints in mud, detecting ambush positions from the behavior of insects and birds. The skills he mastered would later make American special forces question their entire doctrine. He learned the silent walk, a method of foot placement that allowed movement through dense undergrowth without producing sound detectable from more than 3 meters away. American soldiers were trained to move through jungle at approximately 100 meters per hour when attempting stealth. Australian SAS operators trained to Mackenzie's standard moved at approximately 50 meters per hour. But they were genuinely undetectable. The difference was not speed. The difference was survival. Most critically, Mackenzie learned the psychological dimension of hunting that would later horrify American observers. He learned that the jungle was not an obstacle to be overcome but an ally to be embraced. He learned that fear was a weapon that could be deployed against the enemy with devastating effectiveness. But the techniques he mastered next crossed lines that the Geneva Convention never anticipated. He learned methods that no civilized military had ever employed systematically. Psychological warfare drawn from 40,000 years of indigenous hunting tradition, adapted for human prey. These techniques would prove devastatingly effective. They would also ensure that his achievements could never be officially celebrated. Now back to the jungle, where 5 men were about to begin their transformation into apex predators. The first 24 hours tested every element of their training. The 5 men, Mackenzie, Corporal David _6_ Williams, Lance Corporal Peter Hennessy, Private First Class Robert Chen, and Private Thomas Winterbottom, established what they called a _7_ defensive position. Each man dug a shallow depression, covered himself with vegetation, and became part of the jungle floor. For 26 hours, they did not move. They did not eat. They did not drink. They urinated where they lay, allowing the moisture to absorb into the soil beneath them. They breathed through their mouths to minimize even the subtle noise of nasal breathing. And then the enemy came within inches of discovering them. When insects crawled across their faces, into their ears, up their nostrils, they remained motionless. During this period, enemy fighters passed within 2 meters of Winterbottom's position. One Vietcong soldier actually stepped on Hennessy's buried leg without detecting him. Another paused directly above Chen's spider hole to urinate, missing his concealed face by approximately 30 centimeters. The Australians remained invisible. They remained silent. They remained patient. This was the fundamental difference that American military analysts would struggle to comprehend for decades. But patience was only the first phase of their methodology. What came next was far more disturbing. American doctrine emphasized aggressive action, overwhelming firepower, and rapid response. Australian SAS doctrine emphasized something far more primal: the hunter's patience. A predator does not charge blindly at prey. A predator waits, observes, calculates, and strikes only when success is guaranteed. On the evening of the second day, McKenzie made his first tactical decision. Through careful observation, he had mapped the enemy movement patterns. He had identified 3 primary trail systems converging at a point approximately 400 meters northeast of their position. He had counted approximately 65 enemy fighters per hour moving through the area during daylight, with traffic reducing to approximately 15 per hour after darkness fell. And then he spotted something that made his hunter's instincts ignite with anticipation. The enemy command element was located approximately 600 meters to the north. He could tell this from the pattern of messenger traffic, from the slightly better quality of equipment carried by soldiers moving in that direction, from the distinctive cadence of movement that indicated senior personnel. Standard American doctrine would have called for an immediate airstrike on this position. McKenzie had other plans that would turn this jungle into a killing ground. On the third night, Patrol Juliet 7 began to hunt. They moved at a pace that defied measurement, approximately 200 meters in 4 hours. Each step was placed with surgical precision. Each breath was controlled to produce no sound. Each man maintained visual and physical contact with the operator ahead of him, moving as a single organism through the darkness. At approximately 0200 hours, they reached a position overlooking the primary trail junction. McKenzie deployed his men in what he called the spider's web, a semicircular ambush formation with overlapping fields of fire and multiple withdrawal routes, and then they waited for their first prey to arrive. The first target appeared at approximately 0430 hours, a single Vietcong soldier, moving quickly along the trail, clearly carrying a message to the command element. In any American unit, this would have been an opportunity to capture a prisoner for intelligence exploitation. McKenzie had different priorities. Private Chen, positioned closest to the trail, used a technique that would later sicken American observers who witnessed it. He reached out from his concealed position, grasped the messenger by the ankle, and pulled him silently off the trail. What happened next took exactly 4 seconds, and it changed everything. Before the man could cry out, Chen's hand was over his mouth, and his knife was performing its work with a precision that came from hours of practice on animal carcasses. The entire engagement produced no sound louder than a sharp exhalation. The body was concealed within the spider hole, and Chen resumed his invisible position. The trail showed no sign of disturbance. This was elimination number 1. 44 more would follow over the next 27 days. But here's what the classified reports never told the American public. The details so disturbing that even allies couldn't officially acknowledge it. The messenger's body was not simply hidden. Before dawn broke, McKenzie ordered a tactical innovation that had no precedent in Western military doctrine. The body was positioned at the trail junction, arranged in a specific posture that Aboriginal hunting tradition associated with spiritual punishment. Certain modifications were made to the remains that served no tactical purpose except psychological warfare. When enemy fighters discovered the body the following morning, they did not react with anger. They reacted with pure, primal terror. Within hours, trail traffic through the junction had dropped by approximately 70%. Messenger frequency to the command element dropped even more dramatically. The Australians had not simply eliminated one enemy combatant. They had infected the entire enemy network with fear. This technique, which McKenzie privately called leaving a message, was never officially sanctioned, never trained, and never acknowledged. It emerged from conversations with Aboriginal trackers about traditional methods of territorial warfare adapted for the modern jungle, and it worked with devastating effectiveness. But the enemy would not remain paralyzed forever. By day 5, the Vietcong had deployed their own tracker teams to locate whatever force was operating in their staging area. McKenzie had anticipated this. In fact, he was counting on it. The hunters were about to become the hunted, or so the enemy believed. The Australian approach to counter-tracking was fundamentally different from American methods. Americans were trained to evade trackers, to break trail, to use waterways and rocky ground to eliminate their signature. Australians were trained to do something far more aggressive. They were trained to hunt the hunters. On the night of Day 6, Patrol Juliet 7 identified a 3-man Vietcong tracking team following their 2-day-old trail. Rather than evade, McKenzie ordered his patrol to circle back, using a technique called the Python's Coil that placed them behind their pursuers. The tracking team never saw their fate approaching from behind. They were eliminated before they even realized they had become prey. Again, the bodies were positioned. Again, the psychological modifications were applied. Again, the enemy command element received a message that transcended language. Whatever was hunting them in this jungle was not merely dangerous, it was supernatural, and it could not be stopped. Let me pause here to reveal something that military historians have deliberately concealed for over 50 years. There is a persistent myth that Australian SAS effectiveness in Vietnam resulted primarily from superior training and fitness. This myth conveniently ignores the darker elements of their methodology. The 5 men of Patrol Juliet 7 were not simply soldiers. They had become something else entirely. They had transformed into something closer to the predators that their Aboriginal mentors had described in training. Entities that occupied a different relationship with the jungle than ordinary humans. They did not fight the environment. They merged with it. They did not engage the enemy in combat. They harvested them. This distinction would become critically important as the patrol extended far beyond its originally planned duration. By Day 10, standard operating procedure demanded extraction. The patrol had exceeded its water-carrying capacity, its food supplies, and the psychological endurance limits established by military science. McKenzie again refused to break radio silence. Instead, he implemented survival protocols that no Western military had ever documented. The patrol began sourcing water from specific jungle vines that produced drinkable fluid when cut at a precise angle. They consumed insects, grubs, and certain jungle plants that provided sufficient calories to maintain operational effectiveness. They established rotating rest positions that allowed sleep in periods of approximately 90 minutes while maintaining continuous security. They were no longer operating as soldiers. They were operating as indigenous hunters on an extended tribal expedition, and the eliminations continued to mount. By Day 15, the confirmed count had reached 22. The methods varied according to opportunity. Silent blade work from concealed positions, precision rifle shots when distance allowed, and in 3 cases, improvised traps using techniques adapted from traditional Aboriginal hunting. The enemy's response became increasingly desperate. Trail traffic through the area had dropped to approximately 10% of normal levels. Messenger communication had essentially ceased. The command element had begun relocating at least twice daily, never remaining in one position for more than 8 hours. But on Day 18, something happened that nobody had anticipated. The patrol encountered something unexpected. An American Special Forces team, specifically a 6-man MACV-SOG unit operating in the same area without coordination with Australian forces. The Americans had been inserted 2 days earlier with a specific mission to locate and destroy the enemy staging area that the Australians had been systematically terrorizing for over 2 weeks. What happened next would be classified at the highest levels for decades. The MACV-SOG team, led by a Sergeant First Class whose name remains redacted in all surviving documents, had been tracking what they believed was enemy movement. They were actually tracking Patrol Juliet 7. When the 2 patrols made contact in the pre-dawn darkness of Day 18, the Australian response was instantaneous and nearly catastrophic. Within approximately 3 seconds of initial contact, 3 Australian weapons were aimed at the American team leader's head. The MACV-SOG team found itself in a position that their training had never prepared them for. They were outmaneuvered, outpositioned, and entirely at the mercy of men they had never detected. The American team leader would later describe this moment in a classified after-action report that leaked to military historians in the 1990s. His exact words conveyed shock that allies could move through jungle with such complete invisibility. But what the Americans saw next disturbed them even more. When the MACV-SOG team examined the Australians more closely, they were confronted with men who no longer resembled conventional soldiers. The 5 Australians had been operating without external support for 18 days. Their uniforms were rotted, patched with jungle materials, and virtually indistinguishable from the vegetation around them. Their skin was covered with insect bites, fungal infections, and the grime of nearly 3 weeks without proper hygiene. Their eyes, according to the American report, showed something that the Sergeant First Class called predator focus. But the most disturbing discovery was yet to come. The Australians were carrying enemy equipment, weapons, documents, and personal effects taken from their eliminations. They were also carrying photographs they had taken of their messages, the positioned bodies left at trail junctions. When the American team leader examined these photographs, his reaction was visceral and immediate. He reportedly turned away and required several minutes to compose himself. The MACV-SOG team had been sent to destroy an enemy staging area through conventional special operations methodology, reconnaissance, calling in airstrikes, and extraction. They discovered instead that 5 Australians with knives and patience had achieved what American firepower could not. The enemy staging area was not destroyed. It was abandoned. The Vietcong had fled from phantoms they could not see, could not track, and could not comprehend. The American sergeant requested an immediate joint extraction. McKenzie's response stunned everyone. He refused. This decision would later be cited in American military analyses as evidence of Australian recklessness, of a breakdown in command discipline, of psychological deterioration caused by extended isolation. The truth was simpler and more devastating to American military ego. McKenzie simply wasn't finished hunting, and what he planned next would push the boundaries of special operations doctrine beyond anything previously attempted. The MACV-SOG team extracted the following morning, carrying with them intelligence about Australian methods that would trigger a classified Pentagon investigation. The investigation's conclusions would never be publicly released. Its recommendations would never be implemented. And its existence would be denied for over 40 years. The Australians remained in the jungle, and they were about to begin their most aggressive phase. Days 19 through 25 saw the most intensive activity of the entire patrol. With the enemy in full retreat from the staging area, McKenzie made another unconventional decision. Rather than allow them to escape and reconstitute elsewhere, he would pursue. This decision violated every principle of special reconnaissance operations. The patrol's mission was intelligence gathering, not offensive action. They were 5 men against what remained of an enemy force that still numbered in the hundreds. They pursued anyway, and what followed would become legend. The techniques employed during this pursuit phase would later be studied by special operations theorists from multiple nations, always without official acknowledgement of their Australian origin. McKenzie developed what he called the wolf pack rotation, a method of continuous pursuit where the patrol moved in shifts, with 2 men always resting while 3 tracked and harassed the retreating enemy. The psychological effect on the Vietcong force was beyond anything military science had predicted. Every time they established a new position, eliminated sentries would be discovered within hours. Every time they stopped to rest, the sounds of pursuit would resume. Every time they believed they had escaped, another comrade would simply vanish into the jungle darkness. By day 23, the pursuing Australians had achieved something that should have been impossible. They had effectively destroyed the enemy force as a coherent fighting unit without ever engaging in direct combat. The Vietcong fighters were no longer retreating in organized fashion. They were scattering individually, abandoning equipment, abandoning wounded comrades, fleeing in all directions. Unit cohesion had completely collapsed. Command authority had evaporated. What had been a battalion-strength staging element had become scattered individuals concerned only with personal survival. The confirmed elimination count reached 38, but McKenzie still wasn't satisfied. On day 26, McKenzie made his final controversial decision of the operation. Rather than continue pursuit of the scattered survivors, he ordered his patrol to return to the original enemy command location. Intelligence indicated that reinforcements were being moved toward the area. A full regiment dispatched to deal with whatever force had shattered their staging operation. Most commanders would have recognized this as the moment to extract. McKenzie recognized it as an opportunity. The patrol established observation positions overlooking the approaches to the former command element location. They prepared what McKenzie called, quote, 14, a series of improvised devices and predetermined engagement zones designed to make the reinforcing regiment's arrival as costly as possible. But they would not face this threat alone. For the first time in 26 days, McKenzie was about to break his silence. His transmission to Nui Dot Base was brief, precise, and stunning. He provided exact coordinates for the approaching regiment, exact timing for their arrival, exact recommendations for artillery and airstrike patterns. He transmitted intelligence that would take analysts weeks to fully process. The response from headquarters was immediate and overwhelming. Within 4 hours, Australian and American aircraft were conducting strikes on the approach routes. Artillery from multiple fire bases was coordinating fire on the positions McKenzie had identified. The reinforcing regiment walked into a prepared kill zone where Australian SAS observation directed every round. The results exceeded even McKenzie's expectations. Estimated enemy casualties from the combined arms engagement exceeded 400. The regiment that had been dispatched to destroy the Phantom harassers was itself shattered before it could even reach the operational area. The staging area remained abandoned. The enemy's operational capability in Phuoc Tuy Province was degraded for months. But the most remarkable element of this engagement came in its final, bloody hours. During the chaos of the airstrikes and artillery, small groups of enemy fighters attempted to flee through routes that aircraft and artillery could not cover. McKenzie had anticipated this. His 5-man patrol was positioned along these escape routes, picking off fleeing fighters with precision fire. 7 more confirmed eliminations. The final count for Patrol Juliet 7 now stood at 45. 45 confirmed eliminations over 30 days. 0 Australian casualties. 0 resupply. 0 official acknowledgement. Numbers that military science said were impossible. But the physical cost of this achievement would shock everyone who witnessed it. The extraction of Patrol Juliet 7 occurred on the morning of day 30, exactly 4 weeks after their insertion into what was supposed to be a routine reconnaissance mission. The helicopter crew that extracted them would later describe picking up men who barely resembled Australian soldiers. They had lost an average of 12 kilograms each. Their skin was raw with infections that would require weeks of medical treatment. Their equipment was held together with improvised repairs and jungle materials. Their weapons were functional, but showed evidence of modification using captured enemy parts. But their eyes told a story that no medical report could capture. According to multiple accounts, the 5 men displayed something that disturbed everyone who encountered them during post-operation processing. The medical officer who conducted their initial examination noted in his report that the patrol displayed unusual psychological presentation consistent with extended isolation. He recommended immediate psychological evaluation and rest before any further deployment. His recommendation was ignored. All 5 men returned to operational status within 2 weeks. The cover-up began immediately. The after-action reports for the patrol were written, reviewed, classified, and buried. The Australian Defence Force had no interest in publicizing methods that violated international conventions. The American military had no interest in publicizing Australian achievements that highlighted their own failures. The 5 men themselves had no interest in speaking publicly about what they had done and what they had become. The silence held for decades. But secrets this significant never stay buried forever. American Special Forces personnel who had encountered Patrol Juliet 7, or heard accounts of their operation, began asking questions that their commanders couldn't answer. Why were Australian kill ratios so dramatically superior? Why were Australian casualties so dramatically lower? Why were Australian methods classified even from Allied intelligence services? The questions led to an unofficial investigation that produced conclusions too explosive to officially record. The conclusions were simple and devastating. Australian SAS achieved superior results because they employed methodology that American forces could not officially adopt. They used terror as a weapon system. They employed techniques from indigenous hunting traditions that had no place in Western military doctrine. They allowed their operators to transform into something that military science didn't have terminology to describe. The American military response to these conclusions was predictable: denial, classification, and deliberate obscuring of Australian achievements. Official histories of the Vietnam War would mention Australian contributions in passing, usually noting their small force size and limited operational scope. The extraordinary effectiveness of Australian special operations would be buried in classified archives. But the men who served knew the truth, and that truth would quietly reshape special operations for generations. The aftermath of Patrol Juliet 7's operation extends far beyond the immediate military results. In the years following their extraction, Each of the 5 men followed trajectories that reflected the transformative nature of their experience. Colin McKenzie served 3 more tours in Vietnam, each more classified than the last. His final operation, in 1971, remains entirely redacted in surviving documents. Even the operation's code name has been removed from all accessible records. He departed from the Australian Army in 1974 with a service record that contained more blanked pages than readable ones. He returned to Western Australia, to a sheep station approximately 200 kilometers from where he grew up. He never spoke publicly about his service. He never wrote a memoir. He refused all interview requests until his passing in 2012. David Williams took a different path, but his skills followed him. The patrol's tracker transitioned from military service to civilian work as a wilderness guide. He spent 17 years leading expeditions into the Australian outback, teaching civilian clients survival techniques that he had learned from Aboriginal mentors and refined in Vietnamese jungles. In 1991, he was contacted by American military trainers developing a new special operations curriculum. He spent 3 months at a classified facility, providing instruction that would influence American special operations training for the next 2 decades. The nature of his instruction remains classified. Peter Hennessy's influence would shape Australian Special Forces for decades. He remained in military service the longest of the 5, retiring as a warrant officer in 1987. His career after Juliet 7 focused on training, specifically on developing what became known within Australian Special Operations as the Predator curriculum. The details of this training program have never been publicly released, but its influence can be traced through the exceptional performance of Australian Special Operations Forces in subsequent conflicts including Iraq and Afghanistan. Robert Chen disappeared into the shadows of intelligence work. He transitioned to the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation in 1976. His career in intelligence spanned 28 years and included assignments that touched on every major regional conflict. Colleagues who worked with him noted that he maintained unusual capabilities, an ability to read situations that seemed almost supernatural, a capacity for patience that exceeded normal human tolerance, and an unsettling quality that made even allies slightly uncomfortable in his presence. Thomas Winterbottom's story was the most tragic, yet ultimately the most redemptive. The youngest member of the patrol struggled most with his post-service life. He was discharged from the military in 1972, following an incident that remains sealed in medical records. He spent years dealing with what contemporary medicine would recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. In 1984, he established a counseling program for Australian veterans that eventually grew into one of the country's most effective support organizations. He passed away in 2019, having spent more years helping veterans than he had served himself. But the legacy of Patrol Juliet 7 extends far beyond these 5 men. The tactical innovations developed during the 30-day patrol, the spider hole defensive positions, the Python's coil counter-tracking technique, the Wolfpack rotation pursuit methodology, became foundational elements of Australian Special Operations doctrine. These techniques were studied, refined, and eventually exported to allied nations through channels that maintained plausible deniability about their controversial origins. More significantly, the psychological dimensions of the patrol's success challenged everything military science believed about the limits of human transformation. The change that McKenzie and his men underwent, from conventional soldiers to something more primal and predatory, challenged assumptions about what special operations training should produce. It raised questions that military psychologists still cannot fully answer. The American military establishment never officially acknowledged the lessons of Patrol Juliet 7. The institutional resistance to admitting Australian superiority was too strong. The ethical implications of Australian methods were too uncomfortable. The competitive dynamics between allied special operations communities prevented honest assessment of what the Australians had achieved and how they had achieved it. But individually, American operators who learned the truth sought out Australian knowledge through unofficial channels. In the decades following Vietnam, a quiet transfer of knowledge occurred between American and Australian special operations communities. American operators who had witnessed Australian methods firsthand brought these lessons back to their own units. Australian trainers who were invited to American facilities shared techniques that could never be officially documented. A shadow curriculum developed alongside official training programs, and its effects would become visible in conflicts yet to come. The results of this unofficial knowledge transfer became visible in American special operations performance during subsequent conflicts. The increased effectiveness of American units in Afghanistan and Iraq reflected lessons learned, though never officially acknowledged, from Australian experiences in Vietnam. The story of Patrol Juliet 7 is ultimately a story about the uncomfortable truths that official military history cannot contain. It is a story about what happens when men are pushed beyond the boundaries of conventional warfare and discover capabilities that civilized society prefers not to acknowledge. It is a story about the gap between military mythology and operational reality. It is a story about Allied forces whose achievements were buried because they threatened American military ego and international legal norms. But most importantly, it is a story about 5 ordinary Australians who went into the jungle and emerged as something extraordinary. They became predators whose methods were too effective to be celebrated, too controversial to be acknowledged, and too important to be forgotten. The jungle of Phuoc Tuy Province has long since reclaimed the trails where Patrol Juliet 7 hunted. The spider holes have collapsed. The ambush positions have been erased by decades of vegetation growth. The physical evidence of their 30-day patrol has vanished entirely, but the ghosts remain, and they always will. Vietnamese villagers in the region still tell stories about the spirits that hunted during the war. Invisible entities that harvested soldiers in the darkness and left behind only terror. They don't know that these spirits were 5 Australian men with knives and patience. They don't know that military science could explain the techniques that seemed supernatural. They only know what their grandparents told them. That for 30 days in 1968, something hunted in their jungle that was not human and could not be stopped. The Australian Defence Force has never officially confirmed or denied the details of Patrol Juliet 7's operation. The classified archives that contain the full after-action reports remain sealed. The witnesses who could verify the most controversial elements of the patrol have largely passed away or maintained their silence. What remains is legend, rumor, and the uncomfortable questions that special operations historians continue to ask. Why did Australian SAS achieve such dramatically superior results? What methods did they employ that justified such extreme classification? What happened to the men who underwent transformations that military psychology couldn't explain? And what lessons were lost when American military pride prevented honest acknowledgement of Australian achievements? These questions have no official answers. They may never have official answers. The institutions that could provide clarity have too much invested in maintaining the gaps in the historical record. But the truth persists in informal channels, in whispered conversations between veterans, in training programs that trace their origins to techniques developed in Vietnamese jungles. The truth persists in the exceptional performance of special operations forces who have benefited from knowledge that was never officially acknowledged. And the truth persists in stories like this one, stories that piece together the fragments of classified history to reveal what official narratives have deliberately obscured. Stories that honor achievements that governments preferred to bury. Stories that finally give credit where credit was always due. 30 days. 0 resupply. 45 confirmed eliminations. 5 ordinary Australians transformed into apex predators. 1 patrol that military science said was impossible. The phantoms of Phuoc Tuy proved that the science was wrong. They proved that the boundaries of special operations capability extended far beyond what conventional doctrine recognized. They proved that the most effective weapons in jungle warfare were not helicopters or napalm or strategic bombers. They were patience, knowledge, and the willingness to become something that civilized society preferred not to acknowledge. Their story was buried. Their methods were classified. Their achievements were denied. But the jungle remembers. The veterans remember. And now, so do you.